And I served in Vietnam War and the Korean War.
And what was your branch of service?
I started out in the Army Air Corps, which became the Army Air Forces, and then became the United States Air Force.
And what was your highest rank?
05.
Which means what?
Oh, Lieutenant Colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel. And in what general locations did you serve? This is where we'll get.
I served in the southeast United States, in Fort Myers, Florida, and let's see, I served in Canada, in Newfoundland, and I'm having difficulty because I've got to leave stuff out. But I guess the next thing to put down would be the Madrid, Spain, England, and then I guess the next thing would be Denmark. That should do it.
Okay, thank you. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
You enlisted. Where were you living at the time?
West Hartford, Connecticut.
Do you recall the date?
Of enlistment?
Yes.
Yes, 7 April 1943.
Why did you join the service?
Because I was here when Pearl Harbor came about.
And why did you pick the service branch that you joined, the Army Air Corps?
Because all my life I wanted to fly.
Tell me about your first days in the service.
The first days we went to, excuse me, we went to Maxwell Field, Alabama, where we had pre-flight training.
How did it feel when you were there?
Hot.
Were there any boot camp or training experiences that you would share?
Yes, we did a tremendous amount of calisthenics, cross-country running, major drill formations. Every afternoon we had a formation where 10,000 cadets were on the field at one time.
What went on during the drill formations?
Oh, it's just a drill formation where the units just line up on the field, and then they march off. It would be like the thing as if they were making presentations of awards to somebody, and everyone lined up for that, and then we marched away, and when it was over. That would be the best way I could explain it.
And it was hot, so...
It was hot. It was July.
Do you remember any of your instructors?
Pardon me?
Do you remember any of your instructors?
No.
No. How did you get through it?
I was just determined to fly.
After boot camp, where did you go?
To Camden, South Carolina, for primary training.
Primary training. Okay. And what were your first impressions when you arrived there?
I couldn't wait to get in an airplane.
Okay. What was your assignment there?
There, I was a student, and we were flying PT-17s. And I can remember my instructor's name because he was so great. His name was Chichester. He was a civilian. It was a contract school, and that was it. The only thing I would add would be that being a contract school, we had food and everything that no one else in the Air Force had.
So it was pretty comfortable.
Absolutely.
Then where did you go after that?
After that, I went to Cochrane Field, C-H-O, no, C-O-C-H, R-A-N, Macon, Georgia. And there we had basic flying training, and we flew we flew PT-13s. And then there was nothing there special except it was now getting cool weather, but wasn't too bad being in Georgia. And I had an instructor there who was an RAF exchange officer, and he was trying to teach me how to fly, and he didn't know how to fly the airplane. So I can remember his name was Penfold, P-E-N-F-O-L-D. He would, the reason I can say that is he would try to demonstrate to me how to do a loop in a BT-13, and he couldn't do it. He would spin out every time. And I had already done it the first time. I'd been up in a PT-13. So that was easy to remember his name.
And then where'd you go after there?
I went to further south to Moultrie, M-O-U-L-T, Moultrie, Georgia. Spence Field for advanced training. And we flew AT-6s and had all the parts of advanced training, including aerial gunnery.
And then where'd you go after that?
After that, I went to Fort Myers, Florida, to check out in fighter aircraft. And again, this time I had another great instructor, and he was also the flight commander there, and his name was Mullins. It's funny how you can remember the people who did great things for you. And he checked me out in a P-39.
And then from there?
I think it's necessary to say something about the checkout, because we read the manual one night, and the next day we went to the operations building, and Captain Mullins said, had I read the book? And I said, yes. So he said, well, let's go sit in the airplane, and then we can talk about it. So we went out to the airplane, and he asked me questions about the parts of the cockpit. And then he said, why don't you just strap on my parachute and take it up? So I started the engine and took off. And that was the way I was checked out in the airplane. And I say it because things are so different today.
In the Air Force?
Yes, right. And for your information, that's a picture of a P-39, the one where the ball is.
Oh, okay.
The engine is the engine is behind the pilot, and that was the first airplane fighter that had a tricycle landing gear, so it was sitting up with the tail up.
Okay, so after Fort Myers, after there, and you were checked out, where did you go?
I stayed there for almost a year, or about a year, because they kept me on as an instructor. So, and I was instructor in this unit, which was called the Replacement Training Unit. And we trained pilots who already had their wings, and that before they went overseas as replacements. And then after that, we formed the 506 Fighter Group at Lakeland, Florida, and it was the first designated group for very long-range fighter. After training, we went to the Pacific, and we went to Iwo Jima. But there's part of a story in getting there. While we were going across the country, the aircraft carrier Saratoga was hit at Iwo Jima battle, and the aircraft carrier that we were going to go on had to go out and replace it. They had set up these airplanes with the necessary fixtures, and when we got to Iwo Jima, they were going to catapult us off the carrier. And no one has ever done that. We would have been the first ones, but we couldn't do it because our carrier had to be replaced with a little transport carrier, and that wasn't capable of launching us. So we went to Guam, and then unloaded the airplanes, and then we flew them up to Tinian. And we were on Tinian for two months, maybe a little longer than 2 months, while we were waiting for them to finish constructing our airfield on Iwo Jima. And when the airfield was ready, we flew up to Iwo Jima to prepare for flying our long-range missions. One thing I always talk about with the long-range missions was today, when they have programs on the air or whatever they are showing, they talk about how the P-51 Mustang could go all the way to Berlin, and they flew missions up to 5 hours long. When we flew from Iwo Jima to Japan, I never had a mission to Japan that was less than 7 hours. And I actually had 3 missions that went 8 hours. I guess it's not necessary to say much about Iwo Jima because everyone has said it. Of course, when we got there, most of the fighting was all over. And so we weren't involved in the fighting on the island. But we did fly north of there to the island of Chichijima. And at Chichijima, we did dive bombing and strafing. And our object there was to try to destroy the radio stations because they were on the track of the B-29s going to Japan, and when they saw them, they could call Japan ahead and alert them they were coming. We weren't very successful, somewhat, but not, as we would say, totally, because they were all on top of high-peaked mountains, and if you missed the target by 20 feet, it went down the hill and didn't affect the station. So we had quite a time in trying to get those But we did, incidentally, Chichijima was the target that Lieutenant Bush flew, and then he had to bail out, and he was rescued just on the out of the harbor at Chichijima. So he was going after the same targets we later went on. But of course, at that time, the Navy was not flying there. They were only flying there when they were taking the island.
So what would be a typical day for you when you were in the service?
Well, because of the long distance we flew, we had a lot of inactivity due to weather. One thing, the fronts as they come off of Japan are very severe, and if on the way up, if we were to go over the fronts, we would use more gas than the mission would allow. So therefore, we have to wait for good weather so we could go in we cruised at 10,000 feet. But to go over the fronts, we would have had to go to 25,000 or higher, and taking a loaded airplane that high used a lot of fuel.
Where did you go after Iwo Jima?
After Iwo Jima, we returned to the States, and we went to a reassignment place, and because I had previous construction experience, I was sent to be a base engineer. And which wasn't too bad because I was able to keep flying the utility aircraft that we would have on an air base. There I had very interesting experiences because I went to a big depot in San Bernardino, California, and when I got there, there were 3 or 4 of us that were just assigned, and so the colonel in charge of base engineering, he set us up so we could get training in the work. And the first thing that I did was I worked with the real estate people, and the base engineer is the person who owns all the real property on a air base. And after I did that, the colonel sent me up to Kingman, Arizona, and my job was to transfer the air base and the facilities to the War Assets Administration. And I got that done in a week, and I think as a result of getting it done so fast, the next time they got instructions to ship somebody out, I got shipped out to a depot in Los Angeles. It was the 822nd Specialized Depot, and we were basically getting rid of all of the stuff that was there. So I had a job as half a day salvage officer and half a day base engineer. And it was a great experience because the man I worked for was one of the brilliant men that I've known. And I have a little story about him. During the North African campaign, he was a lieutenant colonel on Eisenhower's staff. And after the war in North Africa, the General Eisenhower charged him to develop a paper of concept and doctrine for defense against mechanized warfare, because North Africa was our first real mechanized war. And to make sure that he could get this done in the 6 months he gave him, he sent them back to the States, and George Barnes and his wife and his daughter lived in the White House for 6 months so he could get the paper done, and which was one of the parts of Eisenhower's developed for the invasion of Europe. And this, you got to think about, I got to work for this guy. After that, I was off active duty for a few years because my daughter, my very young daughter, had some health problems, and there were orders to ship me overseas on a company, which meant my family couldn't come. And my commander suggested that maybe I would like to not do it, and he said he could arrange to get me a hardship discharge. So in a week or two, I was out of the service. I was out of active duty. And when I came home, I got in the Connecticut National Guard, and I became a flight commander there. Incidentally, I was a flight commander when I went to Iwo Jima. The Guard experience was good because there were a lot of logistics problems, and so we had to do that to solve those as well as do our flying. And so it helped in setting me up or advancing me in the administrative business. Even though it wasn't base engineering, it fits together that any place you manage, you can use what you learned for the next job. So it was, that part of it was good. And we were called to active duty in the Korean War, and we came back on active duty in January 1951. We moved the squadron to Long Island, and I ended up getting orders to go to the Northeast Command, which was up in Newfoundland. When I got up there at the headquarters, I was assigned to out at a base at Ernest Harmon Air Force Base, which had been, I'll call it a gas station during the war for the planes that were going back and across the Atlantic. But now we were building it into a big major strategic air command base. So it was a tremendous experience to get involved in accepting contractors' work and building this new air base. And so I was there for 3 years. And on that assignment, I was able to take my family. I guess one of the things I have to say is that after the war, when I got into base engineering, I no longer got to fly fighter aircraft, but I did have a lot of fun flying other aircraft. At San Bernardino, they had a flight test section, and they had a P-47, and any time that I wanted to, they would let me take it up, so I sometimes got to go back up in a fighter. A lot of things happened there, and one day the chief test pilot needed someone to go with him, and he called me, and I got to ride down to Los Angeles with him as the co-pilot on a B-17. And we had to go down to Mines Field at Los Angeles to pick up some stuff, and then we flew back, so I did get to fly a B-17, plus lots of other aircraft. I'd say one of the things that was neat, it hasn't much to do with the war or the fighting part of it, but when I was in Newfoundland, we had a couple of what we called L-20s, which was on a civilian airplane called the de Havilland Beaver. And we had two of them, and in the summertime we had them on floats, so we were actually flying float planes off of water, and this was a very fantastic airplane. So I had a lot of fun flying. But as I said, I flew altogether for that 20 years. Oh, let me see.
Well, when you said you were in your Korean War after the Air National Guard, did you see much action of it?
No, I saw no action because what they did was they sent me to Newfoundland, and I was in Newfoundland building an air base, so I wasn't in the war, but I was in the Air Force during the war. And the same thing happened in the Vietnam War, as I was a base engineer at a base in Thailand, but we were right on the Laotian border, and the airplanes that were flying there, although I wasn't flying them, they were the ones who were doing the interdiction on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we had a very active situation.
Did you, so this combat that you saw was mostly in World
It was only in World War II. And it was, as I indicated before, flying over Japan and a little bit of Chichijima.
Were there any casualties in your
Not for me. Our group had a disaster one day when, in our early days. It was the second mission we flew, and the man who was leading the group took them through what he thought was an opening in one of the terrific fronts I told you, and that day, June the 1st, we lost 26 airplanes, and the pilots never came back. And that was the real disaster. We lost some other people once in a while, but not very much. It was just that one time with the bad weather encounter. And I would say, luckily, in some ways, the man who was leading the group that day was not the regular group commander. He was like an assistant, and he didn't come back. So luckily he didn't have to answer any questions. But, yeah, I think that covers that. And we were Newfoundland, and then one of the great assignments I had was to go to Las Vegas, to Nellis Air Force Base. And I always used to tell him, every time I talked to my dad on the phone, I would always tell him that I owned more land than there is in his whole state of Connecticut. Because in Nevada, the gunnery ranges that they have, which take up half of Nevada, were on our records. So I was the owner of all that land. So
what did you do there?
I was a base engineer. Yeah, I was in base engineering all the time. I think when I left there, I went to the Air Command and Staff School. So it might be good to interrupt the chronological timing here, is that before I went to Newfoundland, I went to what we call the Squadron Officers Course, which was the first educational course that was for developing the professionalism. And I got to go in residence. And then as I did say now, I went in residence to the Air Command and Staff School. and that was at Maxwell Field, Alabama. And to continue with that, I got orders later, and I got to go to the Air War College in residence, and not many people get the chance because there's only about 200 in a class at a time. So that was my military education.
And when you went to the Air War College and the Command and Staff School, you were taking classes, you were being educated?
Yeah, it takes, we say a year, but the actual work is probably between 10 and 11 months, because they set it up so that it's in like a regular school year, so that our children can go to their regular school year wherever they go.
And what kind of education did you get?
Well, it's discussion of a lot of theory, and you develop plans, I'll say, a concept for the future. A lot of the futuristic things that happen in the Air Force are developed at the Air War College. And it's a lot of research. With all of our regular classes, we have to make 2 10,000-word research papers along with everything else, and that kind of thing. It's so it's not hands-on like how to fly an airplane. It's the concept of how you use the airplane. I think that probably is that. And you understand that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. You weren't a prisoner of war?
No.
Okay. Were you awarded any medals or citations?
Yeah, I was a person that didn't think much about those things because so many people got them that in some ways didn't deserve them, or let me more correctly, maybe they didn't earn them. And so therefore I was never interested, but I did get the Air Medal and 3 oak leaf clusters. And then the other things would just be the routine, like the administrative ones, like we had 2 unit presentations. Let me get this correct. Presidential unit citations. So we had that happen twice in our flying business.
And how did you get them? Was there a ceremony?
No, it's just a matter of a unit performing outstandingly. A lot of times, not for any specific reason. I guess the last one I got like that was when I was in England, and I was a base engineer at a base that flew B-66s, and the B-66 could carry, although it was a small airplane, it could carry a nuclear weapon. And we were the only nuclear weapon capability in bad weather in Europe. The rest of the units that were there were fighters, and the fighters could only deliver a weapon in good weather because of the way they had to maneuver. So we were very intense, and every month we had 3 alerts. And it's not that they were just alerts, they were actual scrambles. They had to load the airplanes, and they had to go off and fly a mission, and we had to provide all the support for them. And this happened 3 times a month. We would launch airplanes as if there was an actual war. So that was pretty intense. And that unit, because of their record of what they did, they got a unit citation while I was in it. So that would be the kind of thing that would show up.
Were you involved in any battle planning? Because
Pardon me?
You became a lieutenant colonel. Were you involved in any battle planning?
No. The planning that I got involved in had to do with the facilities on an air base, because as in base engineering, I was also the planning officer for the base. And for example, there was a hired civilian architect engineer firm that was developing the master plan, but we provided all the details to them, and then we had to check it and accept them, and it was important at Nellis Air Force Base, because that was a base, and originally all the work that was done during World War II was what they called 3-year construction. It was only designed to last 3 years. So now we had all this tremendous activity. At one time at Nellis, we had 400 jet fighters on the air base. And so we were trying to get the facilities designed so they could do their mission. And now all of that planning that we did is in place, and the buildings are there now. So it was a little different than just, it wasn't like battle planning, but it was in support of the battle planning.
Did you sustain any injuries at all?
No.
Okay, now I'm going to segue to your family life. How did you keep in touch with your family at the time?
Well, during the war, there was no touch, but I was only gone for 1 year, and my son was born while I was away. After that, I suppose the biggest, when I went to Newfoundland, they couldn't travel with me. They had to wait until I could find a home for them off the base in Newfoundland, and then get them to come up there. And we lived in like a little shack, you might call it. It was 3 rooms, and we lived in that until we could move on to the air base. I guess the other interruption would be, because I was still flying, I would get calls to go take a flight to either carry people or go pick something up, and so I was away at most any time. So I guess it really wasn't difficult, and because I wasn't gone for very long. But you can turn around. There's a picture of my wife.
How many years were you married?
Yeah, and the reason I said everything was so great is we had such a life. We had 3 kids, and they liked to travel, and every place we went, as a family, we went to see everything. And I knew a lot of families, and like, for example, in Madrid, with all there is to see around Spain, and people would hire someone to take care of their kids while they went and looked. And in my case, the family did everything.
When you were in the war, in World War II, what was the food like?
Well, I guess the thing to say is it's pretty bad, but when we were on Iwo Jima, it was so bad that we used to go down to what was called the quartermaster dump, and the boxes or crates of stuff that would come in sometimes would be damaged, so they just dump them, and we would go get the packets of K rations and take the little can of meat out of it and eat the meat and crackers, and that's basically what we lived on.
What about supplies? Do you have enough supplies?
Yes, I don't recall anything that was a major problem. One thing, I say the only thing I can think of as short supply, was that we were capable of flying with a big external tank. When we carried the external tanks before we went into combat or into our mission in Japan, we always dropped them, and we couldn't get. We were flying with 110-gallon tanks, and there were, if they'd been available, we could have flown with 165-gallon tanks, which would have given us a lot more time in the air, but they were so short supply that we seldom used them. The one thing we did do is that when we went on a mission, we had a B-29 that was assigned to our group, and the crew even lived in the tents and the buildings we lived in with us, and they navigated for us over this 750 miles of open water, where we had no navigation equipment to do that. And when we get to Japan, they would circle off of the coast, and in that part of that time of the war, they had rescue submarines and on station, and one of them was right off the coast of Japan, and when we were on a mission, it would surface and circle, and the B-29 would be in that area, and we would provide a 4-plane flight to provide cover for the B-29 and the sub. And when we went on those missions, we did carry the 165-gallon tanks, but unless we had an encounter, we always hauled the things all the way back home so they could be used again. So I would say that was the only problem we had that I knew of with parts or supplies, unless you want to say we didn't have a supply of good food.
Did you ever feel pressure or stress?
Pardon me?
Did you ever feel pressure or stress when you were?
I would say the only time, and it's hard to say that there was even stress, but when I flew the P-39, they had, one of the things they told us that it couldn't do acrobatics at high altitude. Well, being a young fighter pilot, I didn't believe that, so I went to high altitude and tried it. And what would happen is when you do a loop and you get up so you're almost over the top, you don't have enough power to pull you through, and so the airplane stalls out and it goes into an inverted spin, and we have a procedure rather, and if you pull the stick back quickly, it would drop the nose and would go into a regular spin, which you could then recover from it. And so I did that, and so then I tried it a couple of 1,000 feet lower, and it still spun out. So I went back up and tried again, and it still. Well, later, we had a model of the airplane, a new model come out, and we had 5 new airplanes, and 2 of the students got into some kind of trouble and had to bail out. So the group commander had me and another instructor go up and ring them out to see if we could find out if there was anything wrong. And when we did that, I did stall out, and I went into an inverted spin. And when I pulled the stick back, instead of the nose dropping, it just flopped over into a flat spin, which is coming down. I would describe it like a falling leaf, but it would go around, and it would go up and down a little bit, but it would be flat. And it doesn't come down very fast. It's not as if you're it's not like being in a dive. And I tried all of the things that I knew, but I couldn't break it out of the spin, so I had to bail out. And that even has a neat story when I talk about how lucky I was. Does that while we were doing all these acrobatics one time when I spun out, there was a Coast Guard boat in the Gulf of Mexico that had seen us doing this, so they stopped and watched us. And so when they saw the parachute and I'm coming down, they were headed for me before I ever hit the water. So, I mean, how lucky can you be? But even at that, I don't think it was stress because we knew what to do. My work as a base engineer you could classify it as stressful, but it didn't affect me that way. I don't know why, but just in my bill, maybe because I always had this feeling as I was so lucky that maybe nothing bad was going to happen. I knew of base engineers that were so stressed they ended up with stomach ulcers and were discharged medically, which was all caused by stress in that work. To give you an example of the kind of thing that happens. So when we were in England, we had, as off-duty, one of the things we did, we had a bowling league of the officers, and we got the wing commander and the deputy commander and a lot of people from the bomb squadrons. And so one day we were bowling. In fact, I think it was a Saturday, and we were bowling in the evening. And one of the bomb squadrons was up with all their airplanes, and the weather was pretty bad, and we lost our runway lights, so therefore there were no lights on the airfield for them to come in and land, and there really was no other place for them to go. So we stopped bowling, and of course everybody went out to do their job, and the system, my people were able to get into the system, and we got the thing fixed so that and then we just went back to our bowling again. And we finished bowling in that for that day. But something like that could be pretty stressful, and those kinds of things happen. But as I said, though those things were never stressful to me. Now that I'm older, I sometimes feel a little stress if I'm doing something with my hands, because I don't have any feeling in my hands, and I have to look and see everything I'm doing, and sometimes I get frustrated and I can feel the stress. But now I can tell what it's like, and I can imagine what some of the other people did. But the kind of thing is that when we had snowfall, which we had in England and we had in Newfoundland, excuse me, the snow removal on the airfield was part of my job, and I always required that one of my officers would be on duty on the airfield while we had equipment out there, and a lot of times we were out and we were driving equipment too. So there's things like that happen that Like, for example, in January 1954, in the first 30 days of January, we had 54 inches of new snow on our airfield. And every time we'd clear it, the wind would shift and blow it back on, so we'd have to go and clear it and blow it off on the other side. And so we were on the airfield clearing all the time. But we kept the airfield open, and something like that could be stressful. But as I indicated, those things never bothered me.
Did you have something special for good luck charm?
Yeah, I did. I don't know where it is now. My mother and father were English. My father was in World War I. And when I was 2, maybe I was 3, because my sister went too, my mother took us to England. She wanted to go back and see her mother. And while I was there, one of the uncles or someone like an uncle, I don't know how else to say it because I never knew the man, he gave me a little boot with a little dog sitting in a little boot. And I still have it, but I never really considered it a good luck charm. But I always had it, and I kept it in my shaving kit thing, so I always had it with me. But I haven't seen that maybe for a couple of years now, so I'm not sure where it is.
How did people entertain themselves?
Except for things like bowling that I mentioned where we were in England, most people did things on their own. And one thing we did was, my family was always outdoors. We got permission to go on some restricted land to camp, and we went camping, and we drove 125 miles over dirt roads to get to this lake. And we camped there for a week. We took a canoe on top of the car, so we were there, and we were out in the wilderness for a week. And we caught fish and had fish for dinner. And as I keep saying, I was always lucky. While we were there, we got the kids, and it was cold because it was just before school started. And we got the kids in the tent, and they can sleep in bed. And my wife and I were sitting waiting for the fire to die out so we could go to bed. And we had this tremendous display of northern lights, which is the most fantastic thing I ever saw. And I'd flown up over Labrador and everything, and most of it's little, but that's the type of thing. That's not the picture we took. That was from somebody else who did that. But that's the kind of thing we saw for almost half an hour. So we woke up the kids, put a couple of logs on the fire, and we stayed up and watched it. But, you know, this happens one day in several years, and we happen to be there out in the wilderness, so no lights around, and we got to see it. So, and my whole life was like that.
You're really blessed. What about entertainers? Did you ever go to any U.S. Sun shows?
Yes, I went to a couple when we were overseas. That was a matter of timing, because a lot of times we might be away or something when they had something, but I did see some. Of course, everyone talks about it. Probably the best thing we saw was Bob Hope. And, you know, people still talk about him. I think we saw one with Danny Thomas. And, of course, they have other people, but these are the names I can remember. there were always movies, and I was not a movie man. In fact, you can figure out the dates, but except for when I was overseas where we had 16 millimeter projectors, the last movie I've really seen was when Dr. Zhivago came out. So I just don't go to movies. Once in a while you see something on television and you'll stay with it, but I'm not a movie goer. So, but we always had movies available. They had 16 millimeter movies. I remember when we were on Tinian, they had a movie, and I don't remember who the people were, but when it started, the actress, the lead actress, woke up in the morning and got out of bed, and she has a fairly flimsy nightgown on, and she gets out of the bed, and the camera breaks, the film breaks. So all of the guys, you can imagine how they're cheering and yelling at this, and then all of a sudden the thing came back on, and what happened was the guy operating the machine had seen this because he was checking it out, so he shut it off, he rewound it and played it back again. So that, you know, things like that happen that are out of the ordinary, and you remember them. But when we were in the States, we always, I'd say always, had bowling alleys on the base, so there was always a big bowling program. But
did you go on leave at all?
Yes, I went on a short leave when we were on Iwo Jima. I got to go back to Hawaii for 3 days.
What did you do?
We just had a good time. We had a swimming pool available, and I guess they had some programs like shows that the people put on that were there, like the Red Cross people. And well, mostly what I remember was that I just went swimming. One time we had a race, and I won the race, the swimming race. But I don't remember much else about it. It was on leave. I was eager to get back to fly again. Yeah, so.
Do you recall any particular humorous or unusual events? You shared some, I know.
Yes. The main story that I tell, and I try to do it to military people when I talk, because it was out of the ordinary. But when we were at Fort Myers, Florida, and we were flying the P-39s, the Army had started to build an airfield out, I guess, 15 or 20 miles west of Fort Myers, a little town called Immokalee. And so there was a runway out there, so we used to take students out. You know, we had 2 airplanes. We reached 1 in an airplane. But we take students out. We practice touch-and-go landings there. So we were out one day, and it was a beautiful day. So I told the student I had with me that we're going to stop this time. And so we landed, and I stopped, went over in the parking area, and I said, don't shut down your engine because you might not get it started again. I said, make sure you double-check your brakes. So I double-checked my brakes and left my engine running, and I got out. And I jumped over the fence and picked a watermelon and got back in my airplane and flew home with my watermelon. And the only thing I can figure is that some other students or instructors saw us, and they saw the airplane sitting on the ground So they reported us that we were in trouble. And so they were prepared. And when I got back, the group operations officer jumps up on the wing and he says, "What happened?" And I pushed my watermelon from my lap out on the wing, and I says, "I guess I was flying too low." And as long as he knew there was nothing wrong with the airplane, that was the end of it. And he just went back to work, and I went to work. And we had watermelon that night. But if that happened today, the world would see it on television, and the pilot would be court-martialed, kicked out of the service. I mean, today, something like that is exploding. And yet, in all that happened was that I wasn't even admonished. But in our work in Florida, see, we're in southern Florida, in Fort Myers, and the air traffic we had to contend with was every morning a twin-engine airplane with a commercial airliner, which was pretty small, would fly from Tampa to Miami. And then in the evening at supper time, it would fly back. And that was the total air traffic we had to contend with. And I told one group of pilots this when I was making a talk, and he got up and he said, "You guys owned the air." And we did. I mean, we could go anywhere we want and do anything we wanted. So we were at the right place at the right time.
Were there any pranks that you pulled besides the watermelon one?
No, I don't think so.
What did you think of the officers and your fellow servicemen?
It varied. Some of the officers, as I've indicated already, were brilliant. Great people, great to work for. And I worked for a lot of them. There were some that were useless. And one of the examples that I give is when I was in Newfoundland. Now, you got to understand the base engineer position is high up on a base. And so when the base commander had a small staff meeting, the base engineer was usually right there. So one day we're in his office, and we had a meeting. We were going over a problem, and his administrative officer knocked on the door and came in and had a telegram message for the commander, and he read it, and then he told us about it, and it was very highly classified. It was a top secret document about a situation, and we discussed it as part of what we were there for anyway, and then we broke up the meeting. Well, when I went home for lunch, we lived on the air base at this time, so when I went home to my quarters for lunch, my wife asks me about this. And I said, "How did you find out about that?" And she said, "Well, so-and-so was talking about when we were having coffee at the club this morning." So when I left, I went right straight to the commander and told him. I didn't use any names, but I told him what happened with my wife. That particular man was a lieutenant colonel, and I don't know what word to use. I just say he's incompetent. When we had a meeting, if he was in the meeting, the only thing he ever contributed was to repeat something that someone else had already said. and we behind his back we called him the parrot because he repeated everything. So there are people like that, but there are those kind of people in civilian life too. Generally speaking, I was very, very pleased with the officers and the enlisted men and the NCOs that I had. When the base engineer situation in the Air Force, we might have, I use the term 40 and 60%. Sometimes it would be 40% airmen and sometimes 40% civilian. But we have a mixed organization, and every place we go, we have a lot of local people that work for us. And for an example, we have the bases where I was, my organization went from 300 people to 500 people. And so there's a lot of civilians. I'm using that as an example because I hired a lot of civilians that were ex-military. And every single time there was an ex-military man available, I hired him first. And I was never disappointed. And I think one of the things that in looking back at everything, that when you're in the military, and they say at NCO level or even lower, you're in a small group and you have a job to do and you go and you get it done. And you might hate the guy next to you, but that doesn't make any difference. You do your job. So you get along with everybody and you just put the emphasis on the job. And you don't find that with a lot of civilians. A lot of them can't work together. Civilians who never have been in the military. But I use that because even when I was at Yukon, I always made sure that we had the military taken care of. It made my job easier. Oh, I don't know what else to say. I think it's just like any organization. You're going to have some people are brilliant and some people are not so brilliant and some are terrible. And there's a mix of wherever you go, whatever you do. I did work for a brigadier general who was my boss at an air base at Dover, Delaware, when I was a base engineer at Dover. And I used to, not to his face, but I used to refer to him as the man that they put up on a pedestal, and then all the people gathered around, whoever wrote a book on egomania, and used him as the example. That's how bad he was. And we got a new commander in the Airlift Command. It was a 4-star general, General Jack Catton. And he fired him. I was told at the meeting when he had a commander's call by someone who was there that, and I can't use the words, I'll use my own words, but he was going to bring this man, this general, up to the headquarters, and he was going to be like the assistant to the assistant gopher in the personnel office. And when he got through and the room was really, really quiet, and he turned around and he said, "Fred, if that's not something you want to do, you have 30 days to retire." So I worked for a general who got kicked out of the Air Force because in 30 days he was gone. So there are people like that at all levels, but it's infrequent. And this was just one that I just remembered because let me say it's more recent. And but I was basically really pleased. I had said something before about the colonel that took us overseas, how great he was. I'll tell you interesting about a couple other men. I went to, well, first let me go back and start this further back. Let me go back into, I'm telling you how lucky I always was in timing. I had orders to go to, I forgot the name of the base now. I'm excused. It's all right when you get older, you forget things. Ramstein, which was the largest Air Force base in Europe, and I was going to be there as the engineer. And I had my orders, had everything ready. We were ready to call the movers to start to move. And I got a telephone call, and it was from the man who, in the personnel office of Headquarters Air Force, he was the one who handled assignments of civil engineers. And this guy used to work for me. And he called me, and he said he had a problem, wondered if I could help him out. They had a place where they had one engineer, and he just had a heart attack, and he's on his way back to the States. And we got to get someone there quickly. He said, would you consider, instead of going to Ramstein, to go to Denmark? And I said, I got to check with my wife, but I'm sure the answer is yes, and I'll call you in the morning. So we ended up going to Denmark into a NATO headquarters there. And when I got there, the base of the staff engineer is in the logistics section. So the head of logistics was the Danish Army colonel. And this Danish Air Force colonel, rather, not Army. And he was the senior colonel in the whole Danish Air Force. And so I got to work with him, and probably he was one of the very top men I ever knew in running a meeting, because we get together for a problem. Each person would make his comment of how he felt about it, and then Colonel Jorgensen would make a statement that here's the answer, and we all get up and leave. And there was no chit-chat. He just ran a meeting better than anyone else. And when he left, and he was brilliant in a lot of ways, but he knew how to get things done. The reason he was the senior man was because at one point he had crossed the politicians, and the politicians are the ones who promote the generals. Even in this country, the generals don't promote the generals, the politicians, the legislature does it. So that he was there, and so about halfway through my tour, which was a 3-year tour, he got orders to go someplace else. And the man who replaced him as head of logistics came in, who was an Army colonel. And here's another guy that I worked for. This guy, during the Nazi occupation of Denmark and Copenhagen, because he lived in Copenhagen, he was the senior man of all of the activity against the Nazis. And one night he told me that he was in his aunt's house, and there was a coded knock on the back door, and he ran to the door and was told, you got to get out. The Nazis have started a search. They're looking for you by name. So he rowed a boat across the straits to Sweden, and that's how he escaped. And I got to work for this guy, you know. It's, how lucky can you be? Later, my daughter was married to an Army man, and they were in Germany. And when we retired from Yukon, we were over in Europe, because my son was over there too in a different place. And so we decided, we rented a car, and we said we'd go up to Denmark to see our old friends. So I get up there, and the man we visited, because I knew right where he lived, and the Army colonel. And so we get there, and we're talking, and the next day or the day after something, I said, Carl, whatever happened to Colonel Jorgensen when he retired? And he was surprised I didn't know, and he said that when he got out of the service, he wasn't sure exactly what he wanted to do. But all of his friends who knew him and knew what he could do, they told him he should get into politics because that would be good. So he got into politics, and he became the Prime Minister of Denmark. And I worked for that guy. Now he was the boss of all those people who wouldn't promote him. So I always figured that's the best story you could feel. But all of these things that I talk about have nothing to do with the war itself. It's just my career was so fantastic, it overshadows everything.
Did you keep a journal or a memoir?
No, I was not that kind of a person. The only thing I kept was my flying logbook, because I did that and I flew so many different airplanes that I wanted to keep the record of it. Right now I can't find it. When I moved into this house, since we moved, I have not been able to find it. So I don't know where it is. There are still some boxes unpacked in that, not fully, they're partially unpacked, but for example, I have maybe 3,500 to 4,000 color slides of all of our travels, but they're not in any kind of an order, and because that was not something that I did. I'm sorry I didn't, because there are so many things like today. I get a chance to talk about them. It'd be neat to have pictures.
Where were you when your service ended?
Pardon me?
Where were you when your service ended?
I was at Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire, at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And when I was in Denmark, I would have extended my tour for another year, but I couldn't do it because as a lieutenant colonel, you can only have so many years of active duty service. And I was at the limit. So the year I came home, I had to retire. And so because I had less than a year to go, I think what they did, they moved me to the closest base, so when I got out of the service, it wouldn't cost them so much to ship my goods.
How did you feel when you were discharged, when that day came?
I was disappointed, in a way, because all my career, I had these tremendous jobs in tremendous places, lots of responsibilities, authority to do these things and get them done. And I got to Pease Air Force Base, and the base engineer was a full colonel. So he was the base engineer, and I worked for him. This man was a B-111 pilot. He flew one of the bombers that carried the nuclear weapons. And he was a squadron commander, and he got promoted to colonel, and they had no place for a colonel slot, so they made him the base engineer because they didn't have a full colonel for base engineer. And in the Strategic Air Command, General LeMay had started this, that every morning each organization has a stand-up briefing. They have a meeting, but they stand up. They don't sit down, and they talk about what happened last night, what they're going to do today, which is something I always did anyway. So we'd be there, and there'd be a problem, and they'd discuss it, and I'd tell them what to do because I knew what to do because I'd done it 10 times. And so the next morning, they're still talking about the same problem. So they were, because I was an old man ready to retire, they ignored me in a way. I ended up getting some things done, and I don't really know that they know that I did it. So I did. It wasn't a wasted year, but one of the things we did. Now this was in 1973. That long ago, the Air Force developed plans to what to do if there was a shortage of fuel. That before anyone else knew there was going to be, we planned, and we had plans for it, and I headed the committee that planned the work at that base. So I did have something, but basically it was disappointing to be there. But I knew, it's only for a short time, and then I'm going to be out anyway. I had to work on getting a job outside, and I came to work at UConn.
So you went to work. You didn't go back. You didn't go back to school because you had already had.
No, during my career, I got to go back a little bit. The Air Force has a fantastic program for people to get college degrees. And I can't tell you exactly, but the three universities that I know that work with the Air Force are Maryland, Michigan, and Southern California. And they actually have part of their staff, actually their teachers, meeting all their qualifications, are out on the air bases. And the crews that are on duty learn the things, and then the ones who at night, they have night classes. So I got a lot of classes, and I got to get a 6 months leave so I could go and get my residence. And I graduated from a little school in Kansas, no, in Missouri, and I got my 6 months there, and I got a degree in economics and business administration. And I would tell you that the studies in that area did more good for me to help me as a base engineer than an engineering degree, because they are more directed in a certain area, and you hire the engineers, they work for me. And so I had to manage them. So I find that was actually the best thing that could have happened to me. So I did get my degree.
Now, what did you do at UConn?
I was a director of facilities, which is the same as a base engineer.
Was your education supported by the GI Bill?
No.
Did you make any close friendships in the service that you have continued?
Yes, I have. I flew with a man at Fort Myers. He was also an instructor. And I considered this man the smoothest flyer I ever flew with. To give you an example of what he could do, at a time when we had P-40s, I could fly along, he could roll upside down and fly in closer than most people could right side up. And he'd go out and roll back up again. And he was the best man at my wedding. And he got out right after the service, and finished his engineering degree and went to work for Boeing. And when he left Boeing, when he retired, he had 300 engineers working for him, and he was in charge of all of the structures part of the construction, during construction of the DC, of the, what was the number of it? The 767, which is one of the modern airplanes that's still flying. So I had that. I've had contact also, but not as close friends at all. But I've contacted with another guy who was a brilliant man that worked for me, and he retired as a full colonel. He stayed in, and he followed me right along. He got to the command and staff school, and then he got to the war college after me, and he came right along behind me. And he had a tremendous career. And I use him as an example because I probably gave him the highest evaluation I ever gave to any man. That's how good he was. I have a friend right now who is the son of a man I flew with. And we went overseas together. And we lost his father on a mission to Japan. And so Richard and I have kept a contact, and so now he does all the work for our reunions, and our group has a reunion every year. So, and he does all that work.
So what group is this reunion?
The 506 fighter group.
So you continue basically the same type of work when you worked for UConn?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The only thing that was easy. There were no runway lights to worry about.
How did the military experience influence your thinking about war or the military in general?
Boy, that's a tough question. I guess let me use this as an example. My personal opinion, from my thinking, my background and everything, that we're crazy to be in Afghanistan. But we do have some people there, and as long as we're going to do it, I feel we don't have enough people there. And I follow these things kind of closely. I'm disappointed that now that we are not, as a nation, we are not doing the help that we should be doing. It doesn't necessarily mean militarily, but boy, you got me thinking about this.